Welcome back, listeners, to Agile Disrupted Season 2. Oh, yeah. We know you missed us because we missed y'all. So, MC and I are so hyped for the lineup we got planned for you all this fall. So get ready. But to kick off this season with boldness and nothing less, we want to dig deeper into a topic that was brought up last season. So, in Season 1, Episode 4, and Episode 6, we had a spotlight on the psychology of the customer and what it really takes to build products that serve our target customers. We even unpacked the differences between minimum viable products versus things that have minimum viable potential. But what we didn't unpack was the unheard voice behind the creators, the owners, and the managers of product itself. As Steve Jobs once described it, the very people who play the orchestra and introduce an unrecognizable harmony that we didn't even know we needed. So, listeners, we welcome you to today's episode, Psychology of Product, with co-host MC, the return of speaker Jake Tyndall, and our newest guest speaker, Kaelin Burns. This is Agile Disrupted. So, Kaelin, first off, thank you for joining the disruption that is today's episode. We are so elated to have you with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely. And okay, so I want to get your thoughts on an iconic quote from Season 1. And Jake will either feel flattered or creeped out, but we'll see. So, the quote is, "Something we could all use in our product lives is conviction. When you do believe you are onto something, and when you do believe in an outcome that is worth solving with a solution that potentially addresses that need. Having a conviction to fully solve that problem, that's the hard part for product management. Deciding when to stay the course versus making a pivot." What are your initial thoughts?
I love this because he really touches on the idea of needing both the conviction of the problem that you're solving, but also having a solution. I think it's really easy for people to get very passionate about ideas and be, really charismatic and get people on board, but not really have both pieces there. Like I've seen people have a solution, but no problem. I've seen people come with a problem, but no solution. And it's very easy to get caught up in that charisma that, founders can bring to their teams. So I think, it is having both of those pieces that can bring true conviction and keep people engaged and keep a team, really focused and motivated to solve a problem.
Yeah, definitely. And just the conviction part is what really gets me, because it's like you have this purpose and this responsibility to know when to pivot and when to just keep going. Because in my experience, I think that's such a crucial point in making something that people will use versus making something just to make it. And then you get to the finish line and it is not the adoption that you were anticipating. But what do you think, Jake, looking back on that quote?
Sorry, I was muted. COVID, everyone. No, I'd say hearing back that quote somewhat out of context to the rest of the conversation it is the conviction, it is the pivot point that are definitely hard parts. There's also so much to consider as well. Where are your data sets that you're really intaking? How do you even gauge what success is, which is a really hard thing I think teams struggle with. And we'll get into this, I think, in some of the later parts of the episode. But just because you shipped a feature doesn't necessarily mean you solve the problem. And I think that's maybe what I was trying to say in a much more concise way. But I do think that's a really hard part about product management, especially in the enterprise, especially in organizations, is so often our incentive structures are around how many features you're able to ship, or if you ship them on time, rather than necessarily really unlocking growth potential or really unlocking new levels of step function engagement. Some of these types of things that truly should be our focus and our conviction is kind of muddy sometimes, and it's hard to study the course.
I muted myself. Dang, COVID. All right, so it's funny though that you share that story, because so for those who don't know, because I feel like I say it every episode, right? So I have my own startup. We've been doing this for a couple of years, and I have fallen victim to like that exact moment of not having the conviction. And because you get like the roadmap and you get the future plans in, and it's like, I need this next big feature because I've got this other customer or potential customer down the road, and I've talked to them, and if I have this feature and functionality, they're going to come to my system. And then I've got my current customers and they're like, yeah, but I need to resend text message receipts. And I was like, well, why didn't you give them the receipt the first time? Like, that's such a low priority feature. And you get like tunnel vision on the next new shiny thing. And what I've learned from my own mistakes and just having my customers call me out is like, I need to have better conviction to say, let's solve this smaller problem or higher prioritize that thing. And in my head, I was like biased and assuming this is going to be a crap ton of work. And then when I finally like pull the plug and say, all right, developer, do it, less than 48 hours later, we were shipping. And I was like, people have been asking for this for like 3 months. And it took less than 2 days to build it, test it, and ship it. And I was just like, ugh. So it's like, it's made me like take a step back when people are asking for something to like get off my high horse of my plan, right? And to your quote, Jake, have that conviction to say, you know what, let me take a step back. What do they actually need as aside from my plan? And, you know, is it feasible to do it? And it's that's why I love that quote from you.
Empathy versus ego. Said otherwise.
Hey, I was going to bring up, like, how often does bias come into play, guys? Like, let's think about it, okay? Like, customers are going to be biased. Like, they're going to say, oh, I needed this yesterday. Everybody needs it. Does everybody really need it? Like, let's think about that bias. Let's unpack that. But it's just like you said, MC, having that target customer need in mind kind of, like, bring you back to your conviction. Like, this is a product for the masses. This is not the product for Mary Jane next door. So I like that you brought up startup, because a question I want to bring to everyone here. I feel like all of us individually have a history and an experience with startups and just like the culture that is within startups. So I'm going to quote Eric Ries in the Lean Startup. So with the understanding that a startup, by definition, is a human institution designed to create something under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Why do we start to see these big organizations, these bigger enterprises decline in lean startup practices? It starts becoming about the business. Like, what was originally a startup was just focusing on the product and focusing on the competitive advantage that our product has and the amount of user activity it retains, turning into this enterprise that's more focused on profit margins and returns. So what do you all think? Why does that decline start to happen?
Kaelin, do you want to go first? I've got thoughts.
Sure, yeah. I think sometimes, you know, this idea of like uncertainty being only in the startup context, I think is really interesting. I think that if there's anything that all of us have experienced, it doesn't matter what stage you're at, like software development is uncertainty. Like a product manager's medium is ambiguity. So whether you're enterprise level growth stage or startup, you can get lulled into a false sense of security the bigger you get to think that things are certain. And I think there's definitely a lot of, you know, product practices that falsely lead to certainty and confidence, like roadmaps. We can talk about that later. But yeah, I think it's just, I think keeping that startup mentality is vital to actually staying very present and focused on the uncertainty that is always there.
Exactly. What are your thoughts, Jake?
Yeah, I would agree. I'd say I would look at like the incentive structure that's in place. You know, if you're, let's say you're listed as a publicly traded company and your incentive structure is to produce quarterly earnings. The incentive structure would be to be able, and within a quarter, to be able to increase revenue, to be able to improve your profit margin, be able to squeeze what value has been able to, you know, get the organization there and make more money off of it. It sometimes is at the opposite incentive to invest long term, to think, you know, I'm going to care about engagement, I'm going to care about acquisition rather than necessarily revenue. And so I think if you look at the incentive structures, sometimes that kind of orients the organization in a high pressure environment to squeeze what maybe is there, rather than acknowledging that the market is ever shifting, and sometimes investments need to be made in uncertain contexts that cannot guarantee a guarantee of, you know, increased revenue or profit margin, and you may actually take a hit for a couple of quarters before you see that step level function change. This is actually a context I'm in right now currently, and it's hard. It's really hard because you're talking about, especially in startups, but often also times in organizations that have like these equity packages for senior executives. Again, whether that be startup or otherwise, like the higher you get, the more responsibility you have to make these big strategic decisions. Likely
Mhm.
your compensation will be tied to some of that equity. And if your incentive structure is set up in a way and your executives think in a way that is trying to produce short-term quarterly earnings, you're much less likely to take long-term bets. You're much less likely to experiment, which is the
Mhm.
irony in all of this, because as soon as you claim certainty and you think you have this plan, the market shifts. And so if you
Exactly.
can think a little bit more, maybe long term, a little bit more, maybe strategic, and also orient the incentive structure of the organization around experimentation rather than do short term quarterly earnings,
Mhm.
you can at least create a culture where it is actually safe to fail. That's something I feel like we read in inspirational quotes and we read in books all the time, that it's safe to fail and we should be experimenting. But how often does an organization actually celebrate some of those failures and say,
Yeah.
this is actually a good thing? This shows that we are taking risks. This shows that we are venturing into the unknown and trying to solve the uncertain. Like, that's really exciting. And it's really, again, it's really hard to do. None of what I'm saying is easy to do.
I completely agree. And just claiming certainty. That's what really hit me when you were illustrating that. I mean, so many times organizations claim certainty and then it kind of hurts the product in a sense because the market changes so fast. And are we really claiming certainty of an ever-changing market? I think that's kind of wishful thinking, but not reality. And when we continue to experiment, we continue to find more problems. Problems never stop. That's what I try to, like, I guess, bring up in these conversations. Problems will always occur, and you just got to stay market competitive. But I think about that, and then let's say an organization they claim certainty, right? And why do you think, like, what leads to creating products that no one wants to use? Honestly, what thought process happens? Do we just end up committing to a lot of features that is backed up by a stakeholder or a sponsor because they believe it's going to hit a specific profit margin, but then the user gets hurt in their actual activity of within the application?
I have worked on, in the media industry, many projects that went down this exact road, where
Okay.
we have like the big like 6-month project to like redo the article page to increase engagement and increase ad revenue, throes of doing it, and then someone rolls in from the advertising department. We just signed $100,000 sponsorship with American Express. The next 4 months,
Uh,
everything is changing,
oh.
and then what winds up happening, right? 6 months later, 8 months later, right? The campaign is rolling, and they're not seeing the engagement that they said they were going to get when they sold them the sponsorship. So now
Okay,
it's like,
Amex.
yeah, so now it's like pour gas on the fire to increase the engagement, and it's this. They're just setting the wrong expectations, or I honestly think a lot of organizations are going for, like, they have this thought of certainty in their head, and they're going
Yeah.
after the short term wins because I just know this will work,
Uh-huh.
and more often than not, I think it just bites them in the ass.
I think we talked about this in last season too. We were talking about how organizations want a guarantee, right? It's not an investment mindset. Like, you invest your monies into this thing and hoping it comes to fruition, hoping you get a return on it. But you have to claim a level of uncertainty to be able to take that risk and be able to be competing with the market of what's popular out there right now. Because I mean, if you continued I guess the safe, certain route, it has an expiration date.
I feel like thinking about that element of risk, like in my opinion, the best way to reduce that risk is to make sure that you're bringing in all the right people early on. So, I mean, I think the number one reason you have a feature or a product that no one uses, you didn't talk to customers. Like, that's probably the biggest one.
Yes.
I've had clients who are like, but we talked to somebody who was close to that person. I was like, but are they the person who's going to use it? And they're like, well, they're the buyer. And I was like, it's not the same
Not the
person,
same
right?
thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it has to, the buyer will be invested at like the philosophical level of what this thing will do, but your user you have to talk to the user. So like, that's the biggest one. But then, bringing in your product squad, collaborating with design, collaborating with engineering early, like before you've done anything, as part of that discovery, including them in your user interviews, because you need to be validating, is this technically feasible? How are people going to use it? Does the market want it? Will someone pay for it? Like,
Yeah.
that's a way to reduce risk, not entirely, but like, you can learn quite a lot and make a lot of decisions before you've written any code if you come at it from that perspective.
I feel like you talk about talking to the user, not the buyer. And it's like so timely for me today because I was on the other side of Charlotte selling
Oh
to a
boy.
retailer And we sit down with the two owners and we're talking about it, and it does this feature and this feature. And I'm looking like over the shoulder and I'm like, there's a cashier right there working with no customer. Why are they not a part of this conversation? So I literally told my partner, I was like, hey, go demo the cashier and I'll work with the owners. And we just like, we divided and conquered. And I feel like, and I got the vibe from them that it was going right. They were feeling what we were talking about. And then I just like said, hey, do you like what you're seeing? How does it compare to what you're currently using? And he was like, this is so much better. I love this. I want this right now. And and even though I felt like they were vibing with us, like the tables totally turned for the rest of the conversation, because then it went from us selling to them to more, okay, when can we get started and how will this portion of onboarding work and how can we pay for the registers? And like the conversation totally shifted. It's like they were in the bag, because they're going to hear more complaints from the guy running the shop 6 days a week than they are from themselves. So it's like, if they're happy, then I think it works. And that's just like a prime example of like, it's the user so much more than the buyer.
Yep. And we talked about this last season too, like key differences between the user, the buyer, the consumer, and the customer. Like they all serve roles and purposes, but we can't let biases not allow us to make a more informed decision. And that brings up the perfect segue. Like Kaelin, you brought up the product squad and how important that squad of people is to make more informed decisions. So one person's bias doesn't overpower someone else's. And the question I want to bring up is essentially, let's say the organization has kind of lost their way, a Mandalorian reference, like this is the way now. So like in that sense, organizations' misperception of product, let's say, leads to misaligned expectations of product roles, don't you think? What are everyone's thoughts around that?
This one I definitely feel very deeply. Like I had,
Bring it out.
I had a real tough conversation around this one where I was in an organization and I had a new boss who had never worked in product management, was not in the tech org. Like my org was rolling up somewhere else. That's a whole other story. And we were talking about how to evaluate my performance and product managers. And he was like, well, we should base your bonus on whether this got delivered or not. And I was like, yes, I wish everyone could see your faces right now, because that is exactly the response. It's like, and I was like, what, say more about that. What do you mean? And he was like, well, you're in charge of like producing these features and this product. And I was like, that's actually not what I'm in charge of. Like, I'm in charge of determining the business value of the things that we should build, but I actually have nothing to do with delivery. So that is completely, like, I actually have no control over that at all. He's like, well, I don't understand. And I was like, let's think about it this way. If you're building a house and you have an architect, do you hold the architect responsible for whether your house is done on time? And he was like, well, no. And I was like, that's the best example I can give you of like what a product manager is. I'm helping to architect this solution with everyone else about how we're going to meet all these needs and do all these things, but I have nothing to do with the delivery of it. And like, it was a great learning moment, I think, for him and for our whole organization about what product management is and does. But I was just so blindsided by the misalignment of like how I was going to be measured and evaluated in that moment. It was like a really shocking conversation.
I love that. Like, I think there should have been sound effects like ta-da! Like, that is the key difference, buddy. But that brings up a great point, though, because like the person that you were having this conversation with, like, how long were they in the organization? Do you know?
Oh, like 7-8 years.
Yes. So this monolithic period of time, they've been with the organization with this misconception of product. That is contagious. That spreads to different areas of the organization. And that's how we experience this, like this mountain message of this misconception of product. Like we have this mountain to climb when some of us have a good understanding of it. So when we see that, like, why do I think that's kind of where product culture kind of stems. Like it kind of gets segmented in the organization. Like this part of the organization that like they're good. They know product culture, but then other parts are still getting acclimated. But I mean, we know that. We're aware of that product culture does end up getting segmented as the organization scales up. But what are ways we could bridge that gap? What do you think? Just keep having those conversations, I think, as a starting place.
Yeah, for sure. I'll chime in here. I'm working with a team right now in our company that they've actually worked with product many times, but I think they've worked with maybe different product teams, different capacities. Yeah. And I'll just get to the point that I'm trying to make, which is they view success similar to what Kaelin referenced as my contributions are on time. My contributions they're delivered, to the scope that we agreed to and all these other things. And I have recently been in meetings where I've asked very directly, I don't want you to finish everything. I want you to finish part of it, and I want to be part of delivering that to the users. I want to be part of evaluating whether or not it was successful, and then I want to do the next part. We will have a lot of engagement over many, many months working with this particular team. And to be very direct, they're not like this is not a development team. This is just like another team that's supporting our business. But they have direct user interaction. And so they can learn. And using the L word, that learn word, is not something we do enough in the workplace. And so rather than building the entire thing, is let's build part of it and learn whether or not it's the right thing. And the look on their faces was just like, it was so cool to see some of the analysts and individual contributors just freed, because they were so worried they would produce this whole thing and that it would fail. And the hard part is, we should all be really worried about this. We should all be actually concerned with whether or not this is going to work. And one of my favorite like charts, and maybe it was like MBA school or whatever, but the more time you spend building that you haven't actually shipped anything, the more risk you're assuming. And it's just a bigger risk and a bigger bet and a bigger investment that can totally fall on its face. And so I think it's the role of product to share that with tech, to share that with, maybe you work with like a QA team, maybe it's someone in marketing, maybe it's someone in finance, but to de-risk the scenario, to say, I just need a little bit of time and a little bit of resources, and let me show you what I can do with that. And if I can't do with what you expect, what we all expect, something's wrong, and we can solve that problem, rather than way down the line uncovering that there is a problem and having wasted everyone's time and money. And so that's what I would say, is use that L word in a very de-risking, very safe space to get everyone engaged in actually solving the real problem.
Oh, I love that. I mean, think about the L word in pop culture. But anyway, go ahead, MC.
No, I was going to say, I think, like, to me, I feel like the hardest part to achieve that is getting folks in the organization to look beyond the grand scale of everything and every potential edge and use case, and just kind of focus on like the primary use case. It's all, you know what I mean? Like we talk about all the different products that are out there in the world. They all have these bells and whistles that for the most part were added over time. So we've got to, like, you know, if someone wanted to reinvent the phone and legit release it as an MVP, it would call and it would text, and it should do nothing else. It needs to communicate. It doesn't need internet. It doesn't need a camera. It needs to communicate, right? So, and it may evolve into something that's not a phone. And I think that's where so many stakeholders, to put that in quotes, right, at the various levels for different reasons and purposes, that's where I think they miss the grasp of learning, because they're so ingrained with the product and their user that they're like, oh, but Sally in accounting, she has to be able to do these 18 things out of the tool. And if we don't have those 18 things, it's not done. And they're like scared to ship it, you know, quote unquote, half baked.
Right. And that comes with so many assumptions. That comes with bias. That also comes with, we actually talked about this in episode 2 in last season, definition of not done. When something stays in the queue for so long, the risk absolutely goes up. This is something that's preached and like breathed in less. So I like that you bring that up, because when we start to see that decline in lean practices, like in lean startup, like the biggest principle is validated learning. How are you supposed to do validated learning if you wait a long period of time delaying that learning, right? The risks go up. And all you listeners out there, just to reiterate the 5 lean principles: 1, entrepreneurs are everywhere. 2, entrepreneurship is management. 3, validated learning. 4, build, measure, learn. And 5, innovation accounting. But without diving into each of them, the one that I want to harp on is validated learning, because many times teams will build something and they have no idea what they're measuring. Like they're just building the thing. Like they have no idea what they're trying to learn from it. That's where the risks come in, because we start treading into a territory where we release it and we see if it sticks to the wall. And user adoption is not a planned activity. It is a crapshoot. But before I go into there, I like to bring up the topic of organizations will take turns using terminology of product ownership and product management. We in this group, what do we think some of the differences and similarities of product management versus product ownership?
I feel like in my experience, and again, like I think everyone's experience is different, which is why this is such an interesting question. I see the titles get interchanged a lot, whether that's in job postings or LinkedIn conversations. Like they're kind of used sort of interchangeably, which I think speaks to the fact that nobody is really sure outside of maybe the product community. In my experience, product management kind of encompasses all of product ownership, but I do feel like there's an element of like deeper collaboration that comes with product management. Product ownership, I think, is more execution focused. And so that's really kind of the distinction that I've seen between the roles. And I think, yeah, they both are, I think depending on your organization, you may need one or the other or both. And trying to, again, that's the very like highest level of like, okay, which of those do you need? And then kind of breaking into like, what are you trying to accomplish? What are your goals? I think can help you determine which of those roles would best serve you.
Yeah. And I'm glad you bring that up because it really does depend on the org structure if you think about it, because the product owner role in its own it's like even the role gets scaled at different sizes because you have the product owner role in Scrum on a Scrum team. You have the product owner role in Less, which is large scaled Scrum. So the product owner is overseeing multiple Scrum teams or Agile teams. And then you have the product owner role in Safe and other frameworks. And I think that those clear expectations are defined by the organization. And maybe they do need a product manager to oversee multiple products and multiple components of a product. That's where it gets really, really gritty into the details. But that's also a risky territory to go into because at what point do we stop going into the lean practices and then we start focusing on output? We start focusing on feature output. And I think about that, and like product ownership, I feel is mostly focused about a dedicated role in Scrum and what those expectations are and at what scale. Product management is more to the understanding and the expectations of the organization. And I think we all have a role to play. Like I think accountability is the big thing that I look at with ownership versus just management, because the team that is delivering the product is accountable, but maybe not the product manager who's overseeing multiple teams. All depends on the structure. What do you all think? Like who is in charge of the delivery might tell us that accountability.
The D word, delivery.
I know. The word that shall not be said.
Yeah. No, I think it's like what Kaelin said earlier. It's
Yeah.
delivery, and whether or not it's time, scope, quality, all that should be secondary to the outcome. And I think a good product manager or product owner, maybe I'll use the word interchangeably for a moment, should be obsessed over that outcome. Oftentimes, ownership, product owner, as described by Scrum, is probably the most colloquialism around the term. And then management is going to be, more maybe all encompassing. I'll also say is a reflection many times of the organization's culture. Using that manager word and having a product manager who is telling the development team what to do is what a lot of companies fall in the pitfalls into, of those pitfalls of dictating requirements, the pitfalls of not engaging engineering early enough. But that's all with a grain of salt. People on my team are referred to as product managers, and I definitely can tell you that they are more alike what maybe product owners are often described as. But there's titles, there's also careers here at stake, like having some empathy for these contributors who are literally in their own careers. They have a resume as well. And manager, historically, for the last how many ever years in corporate America, has meant a more senior level. And it's easier to translate manager versus owner when you're describing it for the next role. And so I think there's also some empathy to have of like, it definitely sounds better to say you're manager, senior manager, director, and some of these things. But what's more important to me, titles aside, and really even frameworks aside, is the conviction to be obsessed over the outcome. And that should be in either of these two roles.
Yeah, he brought up the C word again. So we're going to bring that quote later on in a future season. So get ready for that. Okay, so something, I guess, in the industry that we're in with buzzwords, product people will be described as CEOs, as entrepreneurs, as scientists, as founders, and even gamblers, because you are gambling with uncertainty. What are some hats you all would choose to describe the product person if you were to explain it to someone who doesn't work in software development or like someone who isn't in the Agile space?
I think I'd come back to, ambiguity. Like this is a person whose medium is ambiguity. And I think, a theme that we're all kind of bringing up again and again is this idea of being in love with a problem instead of being in love with a solution. Like if you stay attached to that problem, when a customer asks for a particular solution, you can either dig in to find out what the real problem is or know that it's not the same problem that you really need to solve. Product people are problem solvers, like that at its core. Like I think we're just all obsessed with solving problems. And I feel like every PM I've ever met, like they're the person in their friend group who, whether asked to or not, will help solve all of their friends' problems.
Okay, that makes so much sense. So what you're saying is like to identify the product person in our social groups. Yes.
They're also
There you
more than
go.
likely the foodie. That's something that I've come across is like someone who can describe food in a way that's like an experience. If someone,
Yes.
maybe I'm just being really, really biased because I'm definitely a foodie,
Me too.
is they get it. They're like, oh yeah, have you had this particular dish at this particular restaurant? Because they can describe the flavors and the taste and how it came out fresh and
Yeah.
how the service was great and how the lighting hit it perfectly and it was just the right moment with the sun setting in the background. It was like,
Oh my God.
and the music was playing at just the right phase. Anyway,
Instagram.
Yeah,
this is
really
a little bit
fascinating
off
with
track
me.
from the original question, but foodie maybe is another word to describe great product people.
Okay, so listeners, what Jake is saying to go to his Instagram page and look at his food posts. So, no, I completely agree. I think the level of detail that a lot of product people have showcases their passion for the problem, definitely. And I'm a foodie myself, and I have an equal ability to critique and to showcase. So I will say this place kind of gets a B minus. Like, it doesn't really fit the bill, but I will say this place gets an A plus. So let's determine priority, friends. But anyway, not to go down that rabbit hole, let's bring it back to Agile teams. So we talked about lean practices. We talked about organizations. We talked about the psychology of the product person and the product squad. Let's talk about teams. How often is it that when you're in an Agile team, whether it's Scrum or Kanban or XP, despite the framework, sometimes depending on the relationship with the product person on the team, do we start to see signs where the team doesn't feel they have a stake in product delivery or product ownership, that they're just there to provide a service and they don't really care what spits out at the end of delivery?
I feel like that's the norm, just to be frank. And
Yeah.
honestly, I don't know if it's a bad thing. So I feel like, I've worked with a lot of different teams over the years, and I feel like, oh man, Jake is pointing the gun at me. He is upset.
Oh yeah.
So
that was very slow motioned.
So hear me out. Hear me out before you come through the computer and strangle me, or stab me.
Here we go.
I feel like a healthy organization has a lot of people who really care about what they do, right? Their craft, the product that they put out. And I think at the same time, there's probably an equal amount of people, if not more, who are just there to get a check. And I think you have to have a healthy balance of that, because so I've worked on a number of product teams where, there's 5 or 6 creators. I'm just going to say creators, right? Developers, designers, data scientists, whatever. 5 or 6 creators. And there's really like one guy or girl who's going to like go up to the product owner and say, hey, I've got some ideas based on XYZ. There's usually not more than 1 or 2 people on a team of that, right, normal size team, right, 5 to 10 people. There's only 1 or 2 normally I've experienced. But I've been on one team, everyone had opinions. And that team was because they cared. And that team was by far the most dysfunctional because everybody had to be heard. And Jake thought I was going down his path, but they were the most dysfunctional because it was like, well, I know the design and said this, and I know the requirement said this, but like, I just thought this was a better idea. And they built something different, right? Or they made some changes to the page, or they're like, I did this whole extra feature, and God forbid if you call it gold plating. So I feel like if everybody cares, it's almost like you're going to have so many voices and ideas and stuff thrown out in there, and it's like unwieldy. So I'm sorry if I hurt your spirit there, Jake.
Oh no, here he comes. Go for it, Jake.
I'm gonna hold my thoughts. Kaelin, I saw, had other thoughts. I'm gonna check my I'm gonna check my passion. I'm gonna take some notes, and I'm gonna come back.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one. Like, I have been on teams where by trying to include engineers into the product part of the process, they said, I don't understand why you're including me. Why aren't you doing your job? And then on the flip side, I've had teams where if you try to give them something that is a fully baked, ready to go solution, they're like, I'm not a code monkey. Like, you have to ask my opinion. And, so it's been really funny to get both of those experiences. And I would say like the trend that I've seen is that the more junior a team is, the more that they will like prescriptive solutions because they're still learning, they're still figuring out how to have opinions about things. And so they kind of need something that's a little more like fully formed. The more senior they are, the more they're going to want to be involved, which is why you want a good mix on your team. On the flip side, if you have a really like ill-defined problem, if you're like, we are just starting to ideate on solutions, like that's a great time to go wide and include all those people. If you have a much more known problem, like stick to your trio, stick to your squad, just include one person who can then be representative of the engineering opinion. And I've found in most cases, as long as somebody from engineering was there, the rest of the team will buy in, even if they disagree, because because they feel like somebody represented their perspective in that conversation. I definitely do tend to include people. I think that it really is the best way to kind of, keep everyone motivated and really, bought into what we're doing. But yeah, I've definitely seen it go both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I try to bring up in organizations all the time. Dedicate the people around the problem, not the feature, not the component, around the problem. That way, that dysfunction that you're mentioning, MC, might narrow down a little bit because everyone's bias isn't going to get in the way of solving the problem. Jake, we're waiting for this show that you're about to give us.
Yes,
No, I would say, I think we all have, and I would hope we all have an ideal of what like the best team should be, right? Everybody is involved. Everybody is passionate about the problem, and we're all going to at the exact same time commit and disagree, which is one of the favorite quotes, or not quotes, but Amazon leadership principles. The like we can all talk about things, but eventually we do have to like commit. It's okay if we disagree, but we commit to whatever that solution is and then build with some predictability. So you're not gold plating, you're not doing some of these other things. There's the idealistic team. And I feel like a lot of times organizations, no organization's perfect and no team is perfect, but we stop short somewhere along the way and say it's good enough. And we just got to get something out the door because it's our jobs, because we're getting the paycheck, so to speak. And the reason that I maybe got so animated in my reactions, because we're all on camera here, is because I'm just an idealist, and no matter the team, no matter the problem, I'm always gonna try to vocalize whatever that issue is to overcome. I'll say one of the biggest right now, especially in this pandemic / almost post-pandemic world maybe we're all living in, is the idea of like co-located teams versus offshore teams versus maybe even in the same time zone, onshore, near shore. Like having everybody in the same room as humans, I do feel is an advantage than having every single person distributed, and especially when you enter in the time context difference. Like that's a really big thing. And I feel like, at least maybe I'm just speaking from my own experience here, but from speaking through a screen, there's a lot less engagement sometimes than maybe like that healthy conflict that teams would have if they're in person. I can say that like things have gone a lot more smoothly in my remote teams now, and I actually see that as a problem. When things are going smooth, we're not talking about problems. When things are going smooth and features are just getting shipped, I'm dubious. So to wrap it all up, I would say, and I mean, we could do a whole podcast about this. I think it starts with a culture of hiring people who have that conviction, who have that passion to solve problems. I don't want people collecting paychecks on my teams. Get paid, don't get me wrong, it's great. But that should not be your motivation. If you are here to simply get a paycheck and leave, any other company would love to give you that same paycheck. This isn't the team for you. Like I'm not going to promote, I'm not going to condone or really even encourage someone who is passive. We are active, especially in the product world. You have to be an active product contributor and bring that to your team. That is your role. But even to engineers, if engineers are listening, I would challenge you to challenge your product person, to challenge your designer in a healthy way. Again, at some point, something has to be built. And ideally, it's something that we all agreed on because there's a healthy team culture. But you should be a part of that conversation. And if you get to a place in your career and you're burnt out and no one's listened to you and you are in that feature factory, you should probably find the next opportunity, because there are other teams out there, there are other companies out there with cultures where everyone really is plugged in and product ownership really is shared. That's why, again, I started with the idealist thing. I'll end with the idealist thing. There's no such thing as the perfect team, but I just refuse to accept any one of these obstacles that we can't overcome.
Hey, you know what? I got 3 hashtags out of like both Kaelin and Jake. So hashtag code monkey, hashtag dubious, and hashtag feature factory. Yes. So I loved all those parts. But with the time that we have, I got one more question for you both. So, and you're welcome to think this through. So, is it a success story if an agile team built a product efficiently, but no one uses it?
I don't need any time on this one. Absolutely not. Like, I think, and it's interesting. Like, I was just reading an article the other day, and it was like, the Agile Manifesto is about delivering things.
Yeah.
But it kind of leaves out the part about like delivering things to the market. and that they were actually used. And I feel like that's kind of, this article was saying like there's kind of needs to be an update, like the product manifesto, which I thought was super interesting. And so to me, it's like you can't just build beautiful things in a vacuum. And like I think that that's a really big lesson that a lot of early startups learn, and definitely one that I learned. I think I was reading the Monetizing Innovation, and there's a quote in there that's like roughly like, don't get so busy with the art of product management that you forget about like the science of business, that you actually have to like sell this thing and someone has to pay for it. So to me, if you shipped it but no one's using it, not a success.
Agreed.
I will add one thing there, though. Along the same lines, don't let the perfect design, right, or even like proper design practices get in the way of usability, right? I butt heads with designers all the time because I'm just vocal about my opinions, and I'll say, put that in a drop down. And it's like, yeah, but it's got more than 10 or 15 items. And, design 101 says, you don't use a drop down for that type of a thing. But it's like, yeah, but it's a state picker. Who cares? Like, you know what you're going for. Or, oh God, I had a feature recently where we had to flag items and they were supposed to check the box and then hit a flag all the way at the top to like activate the flag or inactivate it. And I'm like, why are you making our users click twice to do one action? And I got told on because I challenged someone's design. But so sometimes I feel like you can make the quote unquote wrong design decision, you know what I mean? Or even the wrong technical decision in light of like usability. And I think that like that's all that matters. I don't care. Like you can ship a terrible looking product, but if it functions and it's easy to use, who cares if it's not the prettiest product out there? And I think like it's just usability above all else is I mean, it could be inefficient, right? And it's usable and you get a lot of traffic, you'll get your money out of it one way or another. And you can like fine tune it later.
I don't know, MC. This might tread into another Apple versus Android argument, but we're not going to go there right now. Design person. So anyway, what I think about is like, okay, let's say you've established that no one is using your product, but you did it in iterations. You followed all the Agile principles. Oh my God, you did it perfectly. No one's using it. So let's pivot. Let's please do not continue persevering through the product. Measure why no one was using it. What are some risks that you found? What are some learnings you've had? Make a decision. Do we need to go back to the drawing board? Please learn from the experiences you have, especially when you don't have user activity. But Jake, I want to get your thoughts. Like, do you think that's a success story when no one uses your product, even though you did it in perfect Agile iterations?
Yeah, no, and I'll take it also out of like more generally back to the business context, out of the Agile context, is a startup can only pitch to its VC that it's learning for so long until the venture capital goes away. And so like learning is not the answer, although it's great and we should all be learning. And I used the L word earlier. You do have to produce results, and we are all challenged with that. That's why we get paid. Think about like the way we get paid. You were paid $1. You were supposed to bring back more than $1 in value. Otherwise, the company has no reason for you. And so when it comes to shipping features, I view this the exact same way, is that we are challenged to solve a problem. And it doesn't matter if you ship one feature that everyone uses or 100 features that no one uses. The one feature is still better than 100. And that's a really, really hard look to take when you're talking with your engineering leadership. You're talking with maybe even the people who were trusted or who trusted you with actually giving you that funding to grow the team, to go back and really with transparency say, we're struggling with this. And we haven't made progress in this, and not shift the goal line, not change your metrics, but really own for like the 100th time. I'll go back to that conviction around the problem, is that we with full transparency are convicted that this is the right problem to solve, and our solution just maybe hasn't gotten there yet. You need to figure out the better solution, and you need to experiment more. I go back to the process and the people that are in place rather than necessarily the product. And so because clearly the product's not working at that time. Yep. I love Agile. I'm like as a product guy, I feel like I'm a product guy. What's the expression? Like wolf in sheep's clothing. I'm a scrum master in product clothing.
Okay then.
I love Agile and I love Scrum, but I can't let that love to a fault get me in trouble for making decisions that are purely based on delivery. I have to be obsessed over moving the needle. And so yeah, I would say no, it's not successful in conclusion. And I would say you need to take a hard look at how often you're talking to your customers. What are your data points that you're actually measuring? Do you operate in a full environment of candor and transparency where anyone can question anyone? These are like really hard things to do as an organization, but if those things are in place, you'll waste a lot less time shipping far fewer features.
Exactly. And just, I think about that speaking session that Eric Reese had around, like, he talks about like how glamorous like movies like The Social Network is, and like, oh, it should give you inspiration. Like, okay, what would have happened if Zuckerberg like posted that website and no one used it? I mean, honestly, you think he would have continued building it? Probably not. But his point was that, I mean, no one's going to film or talk about the anxiety that the product person goes through trying to make their vision a fruition. They're never going to film that. They're never going to talk about that part because they are claiming uncertainty. All they're going to film is the glamour side of delivery. But on that note, I don't want to take up anyone else's time even further. We are at time with today's episode, but I want to thank you both. Thank you specifically, Kaelin, for joining Agile Disrupted Season 2.
Thank you for having me.
It was so much fun. And thank you again, Jake, for coming back and joining for another reprised episode.
Good to be back. Next time, we're quoting Kaelin, though.
I mean, that's what I was thinking. Like, next time Kaelin's going to come back, we're going to quote her.
Can't wait for the awkwardness.
Hopefully we haven't scared her off. And all you listeners out there, thanks for tuning in into today's episode, Psychology of Product. Stay tuned for the next episode coming up, Agile Disrupted.